History Secrets.
A troubling question arises when we observe the conflicts of the modern world. Why do so many wars seem to emerge in places that, at first glance, have no direct connection to one another? For decades, political leaders have spoken about security, terrorism, and national defense. But some analysts propose a different reading of these events. A reading that attempts to connect military decisions, technological transformations, and global geopolitical shifts. This interpretation begins with an event that deeply marked the 21st century: the attacks of September 11th. After that day, the United States initiated what became known as the War on Terror. Military interventions emerged in several countries, including Afghanistan, Iraq, and later Libya. The official narrative stated that these actions aimed to eliminate terrorist networks. However, some observers raised an uncomfortable question. Why were certain countries attacked even without proven direct links to those responsible for the attacks? A controversial interpretation suggests that these conflicts may be linked to a strategic reorganization of the Middle East. According to this view, certain powers would seek to create a new regional order, an order in which Israel would assume a dominant position. This hypothesis is often referred to by some analysts as Pax Judaica, an expression that describes the idea of a regional system of stability imposed by a central power. It is important to note that this interpretation does not represent academic consensus, but it frequently appears in alternative geopolitical debates. Within this interpretive logic, several Middle Eastern conflicts would gain a new explanation. Countries considered strategic obstacles would need to be weakened, and among these countries, Iran often appears. Some analysts suggest that a potential war involving Iran could profoundly alter the regional balance. A war of this kind would have devastating consequences for all sides, but it could also provoke a withdrawal of external powers from the region. This withdrawal would create a power vacuum, and power vacuums rarely remain empty for long. New forces always emerge ready to occupy them. In this hypothetical scenario, Israel could emerge as a strategic center of the Middle East, not only militarily, but also economically. While these geopolitical tensions unfold, another phenomenon silently transforms the world: the accelerated advancement of artificial intelligence. Gigantic data centers are being built in various countries. Governments and companies invest billions in advanced computational technology. But an important question arises: how exactly will this technology be used in the future? Some analysts argue that the true potential of artificial intelligence lies not only in productivity, but in surveillance. The idea would be to create systems capable of monitoring virtually all human activities, digital identities, digital currencies, complete records of economic and social behavior. In this type of system, every purchase, every movement, and every interaction could be recorded. Algorithms would analyze this data to build behavioral profiles. These profiles would allow the prediction of future actions, and possibly influence individual decisions. This is what many call the digital surveillance state. Countries like China are already experimenting with partial versions of this model. Social scoring systems and digital monitoring are emerging in different contexts. For some observers, this trend may expand globally in the coming decades, especially if political crises and conflicts increase, because periods of instability often justify stricter control measures. But global geopolitics is not limited to the Middle East or technology. Europe faces growing internal tensions. Intense migration flows generate deep political debates. At the same time, the war in Ukraine has reignited military rivalries among major powers. Some analysts believe that the European continent may face years of significant instability. External conflicts and internal pressures may occur simultaneously. In the United States, another type of tension is intensifying. Political polarization has reached levels rarely seen in recent history. Deep ideological divisions fragment society, Some observers fear that these tensions may generate increasing episodes of political violence. In Asia, historical rivalries continue to shape the regional balance. China, Japan, and India maintain complex strategic disputes. At the same time, trade disputes between major powers may evolve into economic blockades. For example, a naval embargo against China could drastically affect its economy. This is because much of its energy and food resources come from abroad. When we look at this global scenario, an unsettling image emerges. Multiple points of tension seem to arise simultaneously. Regional wars, trade conflicts, political polarization, migration crises, technological advances capable of monitoring entire societies. Some analysts interpret this set of phenomena as signs of a profound transformation in the world order, a transformation that could lead to the emergence of new centers of power, and possibly new forms of global governance. But there is also another possibility. Perhaps many of these events are not connected by a single plan. Perhaps they are simply the complex result of intertwined political, economic, and historical interests. History tends to show that the future rarely follows a simple script. Grand theories may seem convincing, especially when seemingly disconnected events begin to form patterns. But the true test of these interpretations will always be time, because only the future can confirm whether these hypotheses reflect real trends, or whether they are merely human attempts to make sense of the chaos of history. Even so, observing these possibilities forces us to reflect on power, on technology, and on the direction our civilization may take in the coming decades. Some of these interpretations suggest profound transformations in the global system. If these readings are partially correct, the 21st century could completely redefine the international order. But only the coming years will reveal how far these trends will truly go. When we analyze long-term geopolitical scenarios, an inevitable question arises. What would happen if multiple global crises began to occur simultaneously? Some analysts suggest that the world may enter a prolonged period of instability, not necessarily because of a single conflict, but due to the convergence of several factors: regional wars, economic crises, technological changes, and profound social transformations. Within this interpretation, Europe appears as one of the most vulnerable regions. The continent faces two different types of pressure at the same time. On one side, external tensions involving Russia. On the other, internal tensions related to immigration and political polarization. Some observers believe these two forces may combine in an explosive way. External conflicts consume military and economic resources, while internal conflicts weaken social cohesion. When these two phenomena occur simultaneously, governments may face increasing difficulties in maintaining stability. This possibility concerns several international security analysts. In the United States, another type of social transformation seems to gain strength. The political division between different ideological groups has become extremely intense. Incompatible narratives compete for space in the public sphere. Institutions are constantly questioned, and trust between different sectors of society seems to decline. Some researchers compared this situation to a curious psychological experiment. Imagine a container filled with red ants and black ants. As long as the environment remains stable, they coexist without major conflicts. But if someone violently shakes the container, the behavior changes immediately. The ants begin attacking one another. In this example, aggression does not arise spontaneously. It arises when the environment is disturbed. Some analysts use this metaphor to describe polarized societies. When accumulated tensions meet triggering events, conflicts can emerge quickly. While these internal divisions deepen, other regions of the world also face strategic pressures. Latin America, for example, remains at the center of economic and energy disputes. Some interpretations suggest that countries rich in natural resources may become points of international tension. Among these countries, Venezuela often appears. Conflicts involving energy resources are rarely simple. They usually involve commercial interests, political alliances, and military strategies. Therefore, even regional disputes can generate global consequences, especially when major powers become directly or indirectly involved. At the same time, Asia is experiencing a process of accelerated geopolitical transformation. China, Japan, and India are expanding their economic and military capabilities. These countries compete for regional influence and access to strategic trade routes. The balance among these powers will be one of the decisive factors for the future of the world order. Among all these tensions, there is also the economic dimension. A possible trade blockade against China, for example, would have massive consequences. China's economy depends heavily on oil imports, and it also depends on large volumes of food coming from abroad. If maritime routes are disrupted, the impact could be profound. But this scenario would not affect only China. The global economy is deeply interconnected. Disruptions in one major economy reverberate across the entire planet, and financial markets, supply chains, and industrial systems would be affected. In this context of simultaneous conflicts, a controversial hypothesis emerges again. Some analysts suggest that global chaos could benefit certain centers of power, because periods of instability often generate extraordinary economic opportunities. Technology companies, financial institutions, and military industries often prosper in times of crisis. Within this interpretation, Israel could emerge as an important technological and financial center, especially if global companies begin to concentrate operations in strategically considered regions. Israel already has a highly developed technology sector, and it also possesses one of the most efficient intelligence agencies in the world. This combination of technology, intelligence, and diplomatic influence could transform the country into a central node of global networks, especially in areas such as cybersecurity, artificial intelligence, and defense. Some analysts believe this could further strengthen its international position. Another dimension of this hypothesis involves global trade. If certain trade routes are disrupted by wars or sanctions, new centers of negotiation may emerge. Countries that produce natural resources would need to find new trade partners, and new intermediaries could arise in this process. In extreme scenarios, even international currencies could change. Historically, major monetary transformations have occurred after wars or deep crises. Some analysts raise the possibility of new financial systems emerging, especially if digital currencies and alternative financial systems gain strength. But none of these transformations occur in isolation. Economic, political, and technological changes tend to reinforce one another. When combined, they can profoundly alter the structure of the international system. Within some more speculative interpretations, this period of chaos could prepare the ground for a new type of global order. An order based on digital surveillance, integrated financial systems, and highly concentrated technological centers. In this view, conflicts and crises would function as catalysts for transformation. But there is also another dimension to this debate, a spiritual and symbolic dimension. Some groups interpret current geopolitical events in light of ancient religious prophecies that speak of final conflicts, global leaders, and deep spiritual transformations. Among these interpretations, the idea of the emergence of a central figure of power frequently appears, a figure that would arise amid global chaos. Some religious traditions associate this figure with the concept of the Antichrist, a leadership that would consolidate political and spiritual power before major apocalyptic events. Within this narrative, global conflicts and technological transformations would be only stages of a much larger process. A process that would culminate in final confrontations described in ancient texts. Among them frequently appears the so-called War of Gog and Magog, a symbolic confrontation that would represent the climax of a historical era. Naturally, these interpretations belong to the field of theology and eschatology. They are not part of academic or scientific consensus, but they continue to exert strong cultural and religious influence in various parts of the world. What makes this scenario particularly interesting is the overlap of different narratives: political narratives, economic narratives, technological narratives, and spiritual narratives, all trying to explain the same global transformations. Perhaps the most important question is not which of these interpretations is correct, but rather how different societies interpret the same events, because the way we understand the world often influences the decisions we make, and those decisions end up shaping history itself. If some of these hypotheses are correct, the next 2 decades could profoundly redefine the structure of global power. But it is also possible that the future will follow a completely different path. History always surprises those who believe they have discovered its final script. For now, all we can do is observe the signs, analyze patterns, and try to understand how the invisible forces of politics, technology, and culture are reshaping the world. Because the 21st century is only just beginning. Throughout history, moments of great transformation have always been difficult to interpret while they were happening. Only years later do the patterns become clear. However, when observers attempt to analyze the present, they inevitably resort to hypotheses. Some of these hypotheses seem plausible, others seem exaggerated, but all arise from the same human attempt to understand the direction of events. The interpretation presented so far proposes a very specific scenario. A scenario in which international conflicts, social crises, and technological advances are part of a larger process. A process that would be reorganizing the global system of power. But this interpretation raises an important question. What if this reading is partially wrong? History shows that grand theories about the future often fail. Experts have predicted inevitable collapses that never happened. Others believe certain powers would dominate the world forever. And yet, new forces have always emerged. The 20th century, for example, was marked by dramatic predictions. Empires considered invincible disappeared, ideologies that seemed permanent collapsed, and new powers emerged unexpectedly. Therefore, any analysis of the future must maintain a certain degree of humility, even when patterns seem convincing, even when events appear to confirm certain hypotheses. The real world rarely follows exactly the path we imagine. Even so, some trends can be observed with relative clarity. The first is the increasing competition among major powers. The United States, China, Russia, and other nations compete for economic, technological, and military influence. This competition will profoundly shape the 21st century. The second trend involves technology. Never in human history have so many technological capabilities emerged at the same time. Artificial intelligence, biotechnology, digital surveillance systems, cyber weapons. Each of these technologies has the potential to transform entire societies. And when powerful technologies appear in an unstable geopolitical environment, the risks increase, because these tools can be used both for development and for control, for freedom or for surveillance, for cooperation or for conflict. A third trend involves profound social changes. Societies around the world face similar challenges: political polarization, crises of institutional trust, persistent economic inequalities, and a growing sense of uncertainty about the future. These social pressures can generate unpredictable political movements. Throughout history, periods of instability have often produced unexpected leaders. Some of them promoted positive reforms. Others led their societies down dangerous paths. It is at this point that religious and cultural narratives re-enter the debate. Many spiritual traditions speak of periods of great turbulence before profound transformations. For some religious currents, the current world seems to reflect these moments described in ancient prophetic texts. But even these religious interpretations have multiple readings. Some believe they describe literal events. Others understand these passages as metaphors for spiritual and moral changes in humanity. Both views have coexisted for centuries. Regardless of the interpretation adopted, one thing seems clear. We are living in a moment of transition. The international order built after World War II is being questioned. New centers of power are emerging. New technologies are redefining human possibilities. In this context, the future remains open. A more cooperative global system may emerge, or a prolonged period of intense rivalries may arise. We may see technological advances that expand human freedom, or we may witness unprecedented systems of social control. What will happen in the coming decades will depend on countless decisions. Decisions made by governments, by companies, by communities, and also by ordinary individuals. History is not only the result of major global strategies, it is also shaped by everyday human choices, by values, by beliefs, by visions of the future. Perhaps the real question is not whether there is a grand plan behind events. Perhaps the most important question is another. What kind of world are we building through our own actions? Because regardless of theories about the future, one thing remains true. The 21st century is still being written, and the final outcome of this story has not yet been decided. Perhaps, when historians of the future look back at this era, they will see it as a moment of great risk, but also a moment of great possibility. A moment when humanity had to decide which path to follow, between conflict and cooperation, between control and freedom, between fear and awareness. The answer to these choices is still open, and perhaps that is exactly what makes this moment in history so decisive. When broad theories about the future begin to circulate, a natural reaction emerges: skepticism. And this skepticism is healthy. Throughout history, many grand interpretations have tried to explain the destiny of the world. Some of these interpretations captured real trends. Others turned out to be merely reflections of the anxieties of their own time. Therefore, any analysis must be examined carefully. Even so, certain questions keep returning. Why do so many conflicts seem to arise simultaneously in different regions? Why do strategic rivalries intensify across multiple continents at the same time? And why are new technologies of social control expanding rapidly? Some analysts argue that these phenomena may be connected by deep structural changes. Changes in the global balance of power. Changes in economic systems. Changes in how societies are organized. These transformations often occur in historical cycles. Over the past 500 years, different powers have dominated the international stage. First, the European empires, then the great industrial powers. Later, the international order, led by the United States after World War II. But no system of power remains static forever. When a global order begins to weaken, new forces inevitably emerge, and the transition period between two orders is usually turbulent. Wars, economic crises, rapid technological changes. All these factors tend to appear simultaneously. Some scholars call these periods systemic transitions, moments when the world needs to reorganize its power structures, and these transitions rarely occur without conflict. If this interpretation is correct, what we are witnessing today may be the beginning of one of these major transitions, a change that may last decades, perhaps even half a century. During this process, different models of global organization may compete with each other. Models based on liberal democracy, models based on centralized states, models based on technology and digital control, each trying to offer an answer to the challenges of the modern world. At the same time, emerging technologies may accelerate this transformation. Artificial intelligence, automation, global digital networks. These tools are profoundly altering the economy and politics. Some of them promise extraordinary gains in productivity. Others raise concerns about privacy and freedom, and many of them are still only at the beginning of their development. In more pessimistic scenarios, these technologies could facilitate highly sophisticated systems of social control. In more optimistic scenarios, they could expand access to knowledge and improve global quality of life. The final outcome will depend on how these technologies are used, and on which values guide their development. Meanwhile, religious narratives continue to offer their own interpretations of events. For some groups, current global tensions reflect prophetic signs described in ancient texts. These interpretations appear across various spiritual traditions: Christian, Islamic, each offering a different reading of the future. In many of these narratives, periods of great instability precede profound spiritual changes. Some speak of charismatic global leaders, others speak of major confrontations between opposing forces, and some describe the emergence of a new era after a period of crisis. Regardless of the interpretation adopted, these narratives reveal something important. Humanity has always tried to understand the future through stories. Stories that help give meaning to the chaos of history. But perhaps the most important lesson is another. The future rarely follows exactly the scripts we imagine. It tends to be more complex, more surprising, and often more ambiguous than our theories can predict. Therefore, when observing the transformations of the 21st century, perhaps the best posture is investigation. Observe patterns, question narratives, analyze evidence, and remain open to multiple interpretations. Because the world continues to change, and each generation needs to reinterpret its own time. If we are truly entering a new phase of global history, the signs will become increasingly clearer. Conflicts, innovations, cultural changes, all these elements will help reveal the direction humanity is taking. Until then, perhaps the most important thing is to maintain two rare qualities: curiosity and discernment, because understanding the world requires both. The history of the 21st century is still being written, and the coming decades may reveal transformations that today we are only beginning to imagine. The search to understand the past has always been part of the human journey. We explore ruins, decipher ancient inscriptions, and investigate forgotten accounts. Each discovery expands our understanding of the civilizations that came before us. But it also reveals new questions, questions that continue to drive our curiosity. Because history is not just a record of the past, it is a continuous path of discovery. Because some secrets of history are still waiting to be revealed.
History secrets.
We are living through a moment of enormous tension in the international system, and some analyses suggest that we are entering a period that dangerously resembles the moments that preceded the Great World Wars. But why? What exactly is changing in the world? One possible interpretation starts from the observation that the international order built after the Cold War is dissolving. For decades, the United States saw itself as the main guarantor of an international order based on rules. In this system, multilateral institutions and military alliances would function as mechanisms of global coordination. The United States would act as a kind of referee, or as some critics say, as the police of that order. But, according to some recent analyses, this vision is changing rapidly. Strategic documents published by the American government itself indicate a clear transition. The priority would no longer be to preserve a universal international order. The priority would be to defend, direct national interests. This shift seems particularly evident in the way Washington has returned to emphasize a historical concept, the Monroe Doctrine, a doctrine formulated back in the 19th century. The central idea of the Monroe Doctrine was simple. The Western Hemisphere should remain under the strategic influence of the United States. External powers should not expand their political or military presence in the region. For a long time, this doctrine seemed to have lost relevance in a globalized world, but some interpretations suggest that it is returning to the center of American strategy, especially in the face of China's growing presence in South America. In recent years, Beijing has significantly expanded its investments in the region. Infrastructure projects, trade agreements, financing for major developments. For many South American countries, these investments represent development opportunities. Roads, ports, railways, energy projects. But, from a geopolitical perspective, some American strategists view this expansion with great concern. Economic presence could, in the future, turn into political and strategic influence, and that, according to this view, would represent a threat to the historical primacy of the United States in the Western Hemisphere. It is within this context that some observers interpret the growing tension involving Venezuela. In recent years, the Caribbean region has seen an increased American naval presence, movements that some analysts see as part of an attempt to reaffirm strategic control over the region. This situation creates a delicate geopolitical dilemma, because pressure on countries in the region can generate chain reactions. South American governments tend to be extremely sensitive to any sign of external intervention, especially due to the history of political interventions during the 20th century. Thus, a seemingly localized conflict could generate much broader consequences, and this possibility of a chain reaction is precisely what worries some analysts. At the same time, another major source of tension continues in Eastern Europe. The war between Russia and Ukraine has become one of the most important conflicts of our time, and also a central point of rivalry between powers. Even when specific battles enter phases of lower intensity, the conflict remains embedded in a much larger context, a context of strategic competition between Russia, NATO, and the European Union. Some analysts argue that Europe fears that a peace agreement could allow Russia to consolidate territorial gains and later reorganize its strategic position in the region. For this reason, according to this interpretation, certain European governments support the continuation of military aid to Ukraine, even in the face of enormous economic and political costs. Meanwhile, a third source of tension remains active in the Middle East. The rivalry between Israel and Iran, a rivalry that manifests itself through indirect conflicts, limited strikes, and disputes for regional influence. This set of simultaneous crises raises a concerning question. Is the international system entering a phase of structural transition? A phase in which the global order built after the Cold War ceases to function? Historically, moments of power transition tend to be dangerous periods, when the distribution of power among major powers changes rapidly. The international system often struggles to adapt. For decades, the world lived under an order largely dominated by a single power, but this configuration now seems to be transforming into something more complex, a multipolar system, with several centers of power competing simultaneously. In this type of scenario, new dilemmas emerge. How to establish rules accepted by all? How to ensure strategic stability? How to prevent regional disputes from turning into global confrontations? These questions still do not have clear answers, and this increases the sense of uncertainty that many observers perceive in the international landscape. Some political narratives attempt to simplify this complex reality. turning geopolitical conflicts into simple moral stories. Good versus evil, democracy versus authoritarianism, civilization versus barbarism. But more strategic analyses suggest that reality is usually far more complicated. Great powers rarely act solely based on ideological principles. They also respond to strategic interests, resources, trade routes, balances of power. And when different powers believe that their security or prosperity is threatened, the risk of conflict increases, even when no one desires a full-scale war. This is a recurring pattern in history. Almost all major wars began as limited conflicts, regional disputes, diplomatic crises, apparently controlled interventions. But gradually, new alliances were activated, new actors became involved, and escalation became increasingly difficult to control. This dynamic raises a troubling question. Is the current world moving toward a similar scenario? Or are there still mechanisms capable of preventing a global escalation? This question remains open, and perhaps it is precisely this uncertainty that defines the historical moment we are living in today. The transformation of the international system does not involve only isolated conflicts. It involves something deeper, a structural change in how power is distributed across the planet. And for much of the post-Cold War period, the international system was dominated by a single power, the United States. Its military, technological, and financial superiority created a relatively stable global structure, but also a deeply asymmetrical one. This period is often described as the unipolar moment in history, a phase in which Washington had the ability to project power into virtually any region of the world, and directly influence the main international institutions. However, in the last 2 decades, this structure has begun to change. New centers of power have emerged, especially in Eurasia. China has become one of the largest industrial powers in history. Its economy has become central to global production chains, and its financial presence has expanded to dozens of countries. At the same time, Russia has sought to rebuild its strategic capacity after the collapse of the Soviet Union, strengthening its military forces, reorganizing its foreign policy, and seeking new geopolitical partners. This process has led many analysts to speak of a new configuration of power, a multipolar system, where several powers compete for influence simultaneously. But this transition raises a classic problem of geopolitics: how do established powers react to the rise of new rivals? Historically, this type of moment tends to generate intense tensions. Some interpretations suggest that we are observing something similar today, an increasingly intense strategic competition between blocks of power. On one side, the traditional Atlantic axis, the United States and European allies. On the other side, a growing alignment between powers of the Eurasian continent: Russia, China, Iran, and, in certain contexts, India and other emerging economies. This alignment does not necessarily mean a perfect alliance. These countries have different interests and often compete among themselves, but they share a common concern: to prevent a single power from dominating the international system. In this context, an old geopolitical concept has regained relevance: the so-called heartland theory. Formulated at the beginning of the 20th century by the British geographer Alfred Mackinder, this theory suggested that control of the center of Eurasia could determine the global balance of power. According to this view, whoever controlled the heart of the Eurasian continent would have decisive strategic advantage. For decades, British and American strategists interpreted this idea as a warning. No power should dominate the Eurasian continent. Otherwise, that power could combine massive natural resources, large population, and continental infrastructure, creating a force capable of rivaling any maritime power. According to some historical interpretations, this logic influenced several containment strategies throughout the 20th century, first against Germany, then against the Soviet Union, and now, possibly, against China's rise. In this scenario, Eurasia is once again seen as the main strategic chessboard of the planet, a space where different projects of economic integration compete with each other. China promotes its Belt and Road Initiative, a vast infrastructure network connecting Asia, Europe, and Africa. Railways, ports, logistical corridors. Russia, in turn, seeks to strengthen energy routes and trade corridors that cross its territory, linking northern Eurasia to the southern part of the continent. And at the center of these strategic routes emerges a country of enormous geopolitical importance, Iran. Several regional integration projects pass through Iranian territory, trade corridors between Central Asia and the Middle East, routes connecting Russia to the Indian Ocean, projects linking India, Europe, and the Middle East. For this reason, some analysts consider Iran a true geopolitical pivot, a point of intersection between different continental trade systems. If these economic networks consolidate, they could reduce global dependence on traditional maritime routes historically dominated by naval powers. And this raises a profound strategic question. If a continental trade system strengthens in Eurasia, what will be the role of traditional maritime powers? Some analysts argue that this scenario represents one of the greatest geopolitical challenges of the 21st century, because it could completely reshape the global economic structure. And when major structural transformations occur in the international system, the risk of conflict increases. Not necessarily because anyone wants war, but because different powers perceive existential threats. It is at this point that many observers begin to speak about a possible historical cycle, moments when international systems enter crisis, and new global orders need to emerge. Throughout history, these transitions rarely occurred peacefully. They were often accompanied by major conflicts, wars that redefined borders, reorganized alliances, and created new international rules. But that does not mean a global conflict is inevitable. History is not a predetermined destiny. Societies learn, institutions evolve, and political leaders can choose different paths. Even so, the signs of growing tension in several regions of the planet lead many analysts to observe the present with concern. Because when multiple crises accumulate simultaneously, the international system becomes more fragile. Small events can trigger major reactions, and complex alliances can turn local conflicts into much larger disputes. This is the logic that many historians identify when studying the beginning of past great wars, seemingly isolated events that triggered processes difficult to contain. The big question that remains is simple. Will the world be able to go through this transition without repeating the mistakes of history? Or are we just at the beginning of a new phase of confrontation between great powers? The answer is still being written by present events and by the decisions that leaders and societies will make in the coming years. When we analyze the history of great powers, one pattern appears repeatedly. Moments of major transformation rarely occur without tension, and many times these tensions arise precisely when an international order begins to lose stability. For decades, the international system functioned under a relatively clear set of rules. Even with regional conflicts, there was a relatively predictable global structure: multilateral institutions, economic agreements, military balances. But when new powers emerge, that balance begins to change. and the rules that once seemed natural begin to be challenged. Some analysts argue that we are exactly in this kind of historical moment, a phase in which different centers of power begin to redefine their positions, and to seek greater autonomy within the international system. This becomes especially visible when we observe the growth of alternative economic blocs. Among them, one of the most discussed today is the group known as BRICS. Initially formed by Brazil, Russia, India, China, and South Africa, the group has begun to attract increasing interest from other countries, especially from emerging economies. For many of these countries, BRICS represents an attempt to rebalance the global financial structure, creating alternative institutions, its own financing systems, and new mechanisms of economic cooperation. This trend also appears in discussions about international trade. Various countries have been seeking to reduce dependence on a single dominant currency in global transactions, a change that, if it advances significantly, could profoundly alter the functioning of the international financial system. This happens because the currency used in global trade has enormous strategic impact. It allows countries to finance deficits, influence capital flows, and project economic power far beyond their own borders. When countries begin to explore alternatives to this system, they are not just making financial choices, they are also redesigning the global balance of power. This transformation is taking place at the same time that regional conflicts remain active in various parts of the planet, and these conflicts often connect with larger disputes between great powers. In the Middle East, for example, historical rivalries continue to generate instability. The relationship between Israel and Iran remains one of the most delicate in the international system. Indirect conflicts, disputes for influence, limited military operations. All of this creates an environment where small escalations can quickly generate larger crises. At the same time, new regional alliances are being formed, and large-scale economic projects are beginning to cross historically unstable regions. When strategic trade routes pass through conflict areas, geopolitical risk intensifies, because different powers begin to see these territories as critical security points. This leads us to another important historical pattern, the idea that wars often begin as limited operations, but end up expanding in unexpected ways. Governments often believe that they can control escalation, that a conflict will be brief, or that it will remain restricted to a certain territory. But history shows that reality rarely follows that script. Alliances are activated, political reactions emerge, internal pressures increase. And what began as a localized crisis can quickly involve multiple countries. It was exactly this kind of dynamic that marked the beginning of the First World War. At the time, many leaders believed the conflict would be short, a quick war, limited. But a sequence of military alliances transformed the initial crisis into a continental confrontation, and then into a global war. Today, some analysts fear that the international system may once again be accumulating similar points of tension: regional conflicts, economic disputes, structural changes in the balance of power. None of these factors in isolation necessarily leads to a world war. But when several of them happen at the same time, the international system becomes more unstable. This instability creates an environment in which miscalculations become more dangerous. Decisions made in moments of crisis can generate consequences far greater than expected. And that is exactly why so many analysts are watching the global landscape with growing attention. Because we are living through a moment of profound transformation. The international order created after the end of the Cold War seems to be entering a phase of transition, a phase in which new rules have not yet been fully defined. And while those rules are not consolidated, the world passes through a period of uncertainty, a period in which different power projects compete simultaneously. In this kind of historical moment, the future remains open. Some transitions result in new forms of cooperation. Others end up leading to prolonged confrontations. The big question is which of these paths the world will choose, and whether current leaders will be capable of navigating this transition without repeating the tragedies of the past. Because history demonstrates one thing clearly. Major global transformations always test the ability of societies to avoid the escalation of conflict. And it is exactly this test that seems to be before us now. But there is one specific point in this global transformation that is beginning to attract more and more attention. South America, a region that for a long time remained relatively distant from the great conflicts between powers, but that is now beginning to acquire growing strategic weight. This is happening for several reasons: natural resources, trade routes, and also the region's geopolitical position within the Western Hemisphere. Among all the countries in the region, Brazil occupies a particularly important role. Its territorial size, its economic weight, and its agricultural and energy capacity. All of this makes the country a central actor in the regional balance. At the same time, trade relations between Brazil and China have grown extraordinarily over the last decades. China has become Brazil's main trading partner, buying large volumes of agricultural commodities, minerals, and other strategic products. This partnership has profoundly transformed Brazilian international trade, especially in the agricultural sector. For a long time, the United States was a major supplier of soybeans to the Chinese market, but trade tensions between Washington and Beijing opened space for new suppliers. In this context, Brazil came to play a fundamental role. Chinese demand for food grew rapidly, and Brazilian agribusiness responded by expanding its production and exports. This transformation strengthened the economic relationship between the two countries, but it also brought important geopolitical implications. When major trade flows become consolidated between countries, they create networks of economic interest, and these networks often end up influencing political and strategic decisions. For some analysts, this means that South America has become a relevant piece in the global dispute between great powers, especially between the United States and China. China seeks to guarantee access to natural resources and markets. The United States seeks to preserve its historical influence in the Western Hemisphere. This scenario creates a delicate environment for the countries of the region, because they need to balance economic interests and strategic pressures. One of the possible sources of tension mentioned by some analysts involves Venezuela. The country has some of the largest proven oil reserves on the planet. Historically, Venezuela also occupies a sensitive geographic position in the Caribbean, a region close to American territory and important for maritime routes. For this reason, political changes or conflicts involving Venezuela often attract international attention and can generate reactions from different regional actors. Some hypothetical scenarios discussed in geopolitical analyses consider the possibility of escalations involving this country, limited interventions, diplomatic pressure, or indirect conflicts. If a crisis of this type were to deepen, other countries in the region could find themselves involved, whether through political alliances or through concerns about regional stability. In this context, Brazil could face a strategic dilemma: remain neutral, act as a mediator, or align itself with certain blocks of power. This would not be a simple decision, because each choice would have economic, diplomatic, and security implications. In addition, any regional crisis would take place at a time of great global tension, with rivalries between powers already present in several parts of the planet. This combination of factors makes the current international landscape particularly complex, because multiple systems of dispute are unfolding at the same time. Regional conflicts, economic rivalries, structural changes in the global order. None of these factors in isolation determines the future, but together, they create an environment of great strategic uncertainty. And when the international system enters this kind of phase, different paths become possible. Some lead to cooperation, others lead to the escalation of rivalries. That is why many analysts consider that we are living through a decisive moment in contemporary history, a moment in which the global architecture of power is being redefined. The outcome of this transformation has not yet been determined, but its consequences may shape the international system for the coming decades. Perhaps that is the main question that emerges from all of this analysis. Will the world be able to reorganize its international order peacefully? Or are we only at the beginning of a new era of disputes between great powers? The answer, as so many times in history, will depend on the choices made in the present era. Because when we analyze the history of great powers, one pattern becomes clear. Moments of profound transformation rarely occur without tension. And very often, these tensions emerge precisely when an international order begins to lose its stability. For decades, the international system operated under a relatively clear set of rules. Even with regional conflicts, there was a structure that provided a certain level of predictability. Multilateral institutions, economic agreements, military balances. But when new powers begin to rise, that balance starts to shift, and the rules that once seemed natural begin to be questioned. Some analysts argue that we are now entering exactly this kind of historical phase, a moment when different centers of power are redefining their positions and seeking greater autonomy within the international system. This becomes especially evident when we observe the strengthening of alternative economic blocs. One of the most discussed today is the group known as BRICS. Originally formed by Brazil, Russia, India, China, and South Africa, the group has increasingly attracted interest from other nations, particularly from emerging economies. For many of these countries, BRICS represents an attempt to rebalance the global financial system by creating alternative institutions, independent financing mechanisms, and new forms of economic cooperation. This trend is also visible in discussions about international trade. Several countries are seeking to reduce their dependence on a single dominant currency in global transactions, a shift that, if it advances significantly, could transform the international financial system. This is because the currency used in global trade carries enormous strategic weight. It allows nations to finance deficits, influence capital flows, and project economic power far beyond their own borders. When countries begin exploring alternatives to this system, they are not simply making financial decisions. They are actively reshaping the global balance of power. At the same time, regional conflicts continue across different parts of the world, and these conflicts are often connected to broader rivalries between major powers. In the Middle East, for instance, long-standing rivalries continue to fuel instability. The relationship between Israel and Iran remains one of the most fragile in the international system. Indirect conflicts, power struggles, limited military actions, all contribute to an environment where smaller escalations can quickly spiral into larger crises. Meanwhile, new regional alliances are taking shape, and large-scale economic projects are crossing areas that have historically been unstable. When strategic trade routes pass through regions of conflict, geopolitical risks increase significantly, because these territories become critical points of security interest for multiple powers. This leads us to another recurring historical pattern. Wars often begin as limited operations, but expand far beyond initial expectations. Governments frequently believe they can control escalation, that conflicts will remain contained, or that they will be short-lived. But history consistently shows otherwise. Alliances are activated, political pressures rise, internal dynamics intensify. And what starts as a localized crisis can quickly draw in multiple nations. This was exactly the dynamic that led to the outbreak of the First World War. At the time, many leaders believed the war would be brief, a limited conflict, quick and controlled. Instead, a chain of alliances transformed the crisis into a continental war, and ultimately into a global conflict. Today, some analysts fear that the international system may once again be accumulating similar pressures: regional conflicts, economic tensions, structural shifts in the balance of power. Individually, none of these factors necessarily leads to global war, but when they occur simultaneously, they create a far more unstable system. This instability increases the risk of miscalculation. Decisions made under pressure can trigger consequences far beyond what was intended. And that is precisely why many analysts are observing the global situation with increasing concern, because we are living through a period of deep transformation. The international order established after the Cold War appears to be entering a transitional phase, a phase in which new rules have yet to be fully defined. And while these rules remain uncertain, the world moves through a period of instability, a time when multiple visions of power compete simultaneously. In moments like this, the future remains open. Some transitions lead to cooperation, others result in prolonged confrontation. The central question is which path will be chosen, and whether today's leadership will be capable of navigating this transition without repeating past mistakes. Because history makes one thing clear: major global transformations always test the ability of societies to prevent escalation. And that is exactly the test we seem to be facing now. Throughout this documentary, we explored evidence, accounts, and discoveries that attempt to explain this historical event. But one question remains unanswered. If everything happened exactly as we believe, then why are there so many contradictory records? Why do certain details seem to have disappeared from official history? Perhaps because this mystery has not yet been fully resolved, and perhaps there are still clues waiting to be discovered. Because some secrets of history are still waiting to be revealed.
History secrets.
What happens when someone decides to truly teach within a system that doesn't want to learn? In 2008, a young Yale graduate arrives in southern China with a clear mission. He didn't just want to prepare students to enter foreign universities. He wanted to prepare them for life. At the time, the landscape was quite different. Few students were seeking to study abroad, and international schools were still rare. Even so, at that specific school, about 10% of students planned to follow that path. Around 80 students per year. The number seemed promising, but the method was completely wrong. Students spent hours in crowded classrooms, copying notes, memorizing content, and repeating patterns. There was no space for questions, no debate, no critical thinking. It was a system based on repetition. In addition, there was an obsession with the SAT exam. Students memorized endless lists of words, without context, without real reading, without meaningful writing. It was an artificial preparation for a world that demanded exactly the opposite. And then came extracurricular activities. Most participated in Model United Nations, an activity considered prestigious. But there was an obvious problem. Everyone was doing the same thing. There was no differentiation, no identity, no real experience. It was at this moment that he realized something essential. Getting into a good university was not the problem. The real problem was surviving after getting in. The solution would not come from small adjustments. It was necessary to change the logic of the system. The first change was radical. Traditional classes were replaced by seminars. Instead of rooms with 50 silent students, small groups of 10 to 20 gathered to discuss books. They read. They debated. They questioned. For the first time, learning became an active experience. The second change was even deeper. Memorizing words was no longer the priority. Reading became the center of the process. A library with 5,000 books in English was created. Students could choose, explore, discover. The goal was not just to learn English. It was to awaken the pleasure of reading. And then came the boldest break. Traditional activities were eliminated. In their place, real experiences emerged. The first was the coffee house, a cafe inside the school, managed by the students themselves. They handled service, operations, finances. They learned in practice what responsibility, collaboration, and entrepreneurship mean. It was not a simulation. It was reality. The second initiative was even more intense. A daily newspaper. Every day, students had to investigate, write, edit, and publish. They worked late into the night, sometimes until dawn. And still, the next day, they delivered the newspaper to the entire school. That was not just an activity. It was training for the real world. But changing activities was not enough. It was necessary to change the culture. 3 principles began to guide everything: transparency, innovation, total openness. Nothing was fixed. The curriculum was not treated as something perfect. It evolved constantly. Mistakes were acknowledged. Adjustments were made collectively. Chaos was part of the process. And, surprisingly, it worked. In a short time, the program became extremely effective. Students began to stand out. They entered elite universities like Yale, Wharton, and Cornell. The program became the most respected in southern China. The results were undeniable. Everything seemed perfect, until everything collapsed. He was fired, without warning, without negotiation. And that was not all. Teachers, parents, and even students were satisfied with his departure. No one wanted him to stay. Even after creating one of the most successful programs in the country, he was never invited again to lead another. The system rejected him. But why? The answer is not in the success. It is in how the game works. He believed he was being seen as a reformer, a visionary, an idealist. But that was not the real perception. The word used to describe him was different. Dictator. Or, even more directly, someone difficult, uncomfortable, impossible to deal with. The reason was simple. He insisted on fairness. It didn't matter who the students were. It didn't matter who the parents were. Everyone had to work hard. And that broke the logic of the system. Because the system is not built on fairness. It is built on interests. That was when he began to see everything differently. Education was not just a process. It was a game. And like any game, there were players. Students, parents, teachers, administrators, government, universities, each with their own interests. And understanding those interests was the key to understanding everything that happened. Initially, he believed that students wanted to learn, that they sought to improve. But that was not entirely true. Students wanted results, with the least effort possible. Parents wanted success for their children. But in practice, they wanted status. They wanted to be able to say their children were in prestigious universities. The process didn't matter. The symbol did. Teachers were not focused on transforming lives. They were trying to survive, do the minimum necessary, receive their salary, and move on. Administrators wanted to maintain stability, avoid conflict, satisfy the most influential parents. The government wanted one thing above all: no problems. And the universities? They wanted students who could pay, nothing more. And then the central principle emerges. In game theory, all participants seek the same objective, the best possible outcome, with the least effort possible. This is the invisible logic that sustains the system. And when someone tries to change this logic, they are not just proposing improvements. They are breaking the game, and the system reacts. It doesn't matter how good the results are. What matters is whether you respect the unwritten rules. Because in the end, it's not about education. It's about control. If you understand this, you begin to see something even deeper. The problem was never the method. The problem was the alignment of interests. A system only works when the main players agree, even silently, with the rules of the game. And those rules don't have to be fair. They only need to be convenient for those in power. That is exactly where everything came into conflict. To understand this clearly, it is necessary to observe not only who participates in the game, but who truly matters within it. Not all players carry the same weight. This is one of the most important lessons of game theory. On the surface, it seems that students are the center of education. They are the ones who attend school, who study, who take exams. But in practice, they have little influence. What students think rarely defines the rules. Those who define the game are the ones who sustain the system. And in this case, the most important were not the students. They were the parents. Parents are the ones who pay. They are the ones who can create problems. They are the ones who pressure the school. And because of that, their expectations shape how everything works. Right after, come the teachers, because they are the ones who execute the rules. They are the ones who turn decisions into practice. If teachers do not adhere, the system does not function. Administrators have an intermediate role. They adjust, negotiate, balance interests. But deep down, they are also trapped in the same logic of survival. The government, despite appearing powerful, has little real interference in the daily life of a specific school. As long as there are no problems, everything is acceptable. Universities, in turn, are also not deeply involved. They operate as a final stage of the process. They select, receive, and move on. Their focus is not the student's development. It is the continuous flow of applicants. When you mentally reorganize these weights, something becomes clear. The game is not built around learning. It is built around stability, status, and convenience. And this completely changes how every decision is made. Now, look at the students again. What truly motivates a student? It is not just learning. It is being accepted. It is belonging. It is building relationships. It is avoiding conflict. School, for many, is first and foremost a social space. Learning is just one part of the experience, and often, not even the main one. In addition, there is a decisive factor: the need to please. Students know, even unconsciously, that they depend on parency, depend on teachers, depend on evaluations. So their behavior adapts. They don't study necessarily to learn. They study to meet expectations. Grades become a form of approval, not of knowledge. Now observe parents more precisely. The discourse is about their children's future, but the real motivation is often different. Status, recognition, social validation. Having a child in a prestigious university is not just an academic achievement. It is a symbol. It is a way of telling the world that you succeeded. And this turns education into a product, a luxury product. The more expensive, the more valuable it seems. Quality does not necessarily matter. Perception matters. Image matters. And this explains decisions that, at first glance, seem irrational. Schools are chosen not for what they teach, but for how they are perceived. Teachers are valued not for their impact, but for their appearance. The system becomes performative. And then come the teachers. Many enter the profession with genuine intention. But the system shapes behavior. Over time, limitations emerge. Fatigue, external responsibilities, lack of recognition, and gradually, the focus shifts. Teaching stops being a mission and becomes a job. The objective becomes simple. Do what is necessary. Avoid problems. Maintain stability. It is not necessarily a lack of character. It is adaptation to the environment. Administrators follow the same logic. They are not there to revolutionize. They are there to keep the system functioning. Avoid conflicts with parents. Ensure apparent results. Preserve the school's reputation. Every decision is filtered through a silent question. Will this create a problem? If the answer is yes, the change is avoided, even if it is necessary. And then, when all these interests meet, something inevitable happens. The game forms. Not in an explicit way, but organically. The rules emerge from the point where these interests converge. And at that point, any attempt at real change becomes a threat. Because changing the system means altering incentives. It means demanding more effort. It means breaking established comforts. And no one wants that. That is exactly what happened. The new model worked. Students improved. Results were superior. But it required something the system was not willing to offer. Real effort. Responsibility. Autonomy. And that generated resistance. Not because it was wrong, but because it was incompatible with the existing game. This is the hardest point to accept. You can be right. You can generate results. You can improve everything, and still be rejected, because the problem was never efficiency. It was alignment. When you try to change a system without understanding the interests that sustain it, you are not reforming. You are confronting. And confrontations, within structured systems, are rarely accepted. They are neutralized, silenced, removed. And then, an inevitable question arises. If the system does not reward those who truly improve things, then what does it actually reward? The answer is not comfortable, but it is necessary. The system rewards those who play according to its rules. Even if those rules do not lead to the best possible outcome, even if they keep everything in the same place, even if they limit potential, because in the end, stability is more valuable than excellence. And this does not happen only in education. This pattern repeats across different fields. Companies, governments, organizations. Whenever interests converge to preserve the status quo, deep changes become threats. And those who promote those changes become problems. The question then stops being technical, stops being pedagogical, and becomes strategic. If you want to transform a system, it is not enough to be right. You must understand the game, understand the incentives, understand who wins and who loses, and above all, understand what each player is trying to protect. Because that is where the real dynamics happen. Then, an even deeper shift in perspective emerges. The question is no longer how to improve the system. It becomes something else. How do you change a system without being expelled by it? Because at that moment, it became clear that good ideas are not enough. Results are not enough. Not even success protects you. If the system does not recognize value in what you do, it will not absorb you. It will reject you. And this happens in a silent but extremely efficient way. The initial mistake was not technical. It was strategic. He tried to build a new game inside a system that did not want to change. And worse, he did it without aligning the interests of the most important players. That created a rupture the system could not accept. In game theory, there is an essential principle. Players do not change behavior because of ideas. They change because of incentives. If the incentive remains the same, behavior remains the same. This means that any attempt at real transformation must begin elsewhere, not with content, but with incentives. Look at what happened in practice. Students improved, but that required more effort, so it was not attractive to them. Parents saw good results, but they did not see control, and without control, they felt insecure. Teachers were pushed out of their comfort zone, and that generated resistance. Administrators saw risk, and risk for them was something to be avoided. In other words, everyone had something to lose, even if, in the long run, everyone would gain. This is one of the most counterintuitive points. Systems are rarely guided by the long term. They are guided by the short term, by the immediate, by what keeps everything working today. And any change that threatens this immediate balance tends to be rejected, even if it is better. So what could have been done differently? Perhaps it was not necessary to change everything at once. Perhaps the change could have been gradual, introduced almost invisibly, without creating shock, without exposing the system to rupture. Because when change is perceived as a threat, it activates defense mechanisms, and those mechanisms are extremely strong. Another possibility would be to align incentives. Make each player feel that they are winning, even if, in practice, they are being guided toward a new behavior. Students could see immediate benefits. Parents could maintain a sense of control. Teachers could be rewarded for adapting. Administrators could perceive safety. Without that, any change becomes a direct confrontation. And direct confrontations, within complex systems, rarely win. There is also a third dimension: perception. It is not enough to do something good. Others need to perceive it as good. And more than that, they need to perceive it as something that does not threaten their interests. Because the moment something appears threatening, the reaction is automatic. Rejection, labeling, isolation. That is exactly what happened. He was not seen as someone who improved the system. He was seen as someone who destabilized the system. And in that context, the result matters little. Perception matters. This leads to a difficult but fundamental conclusion. The most direct path is not always the most effective. Sometimes, real transformation requires strategy. It requires patience. It requires reading the context. And above all, it requires a deep understanding of human nature. Because in the end, systems are not made of rules. They are made of people, and people do not operate only with logic. They operate with fear, with interest, with comfort, with status. And any change that ignores this is bound to encounter resistance. So perhaps the greatest lesson is not in education, but in how any social structure functions. If you want to change something, you need to understand the game before playing. You need to know who the players are, what they want, what they fear losing, and what they are trying to preserve. Without that, even the best idea can fail. And perhaps this is the most important part of this entire story. The failure did not come from a lack of competence, nor from a lack of results. It came from a lack of alignment. It came from trying to change the system without first deeply understanding its invisible mechanisms. Because at its core, the system was never about learning, never about merit, never about excellence. It was about balancing interests. And that balance, however imperfect, is protected at all costs. Now the question changes again. If you already understand the game, what do you do with it? Do you try to change it? Do you play within the rules? Or do you find a way to influence it without being noticed? There is no single answer. But there is one certainty. Ignoring the game is never an option. Because when you ignore the game, you are not outside of it. You just don't understand why you are losing. Throughout this documentary, we explored evidence, accounts, and discoveries that attempt to explain this historical event. But one question remains unanswered. If everything happened exactly as we believe, then why are there so many contradictory records? Why do certain details seem to have disappeared from official history? Perhaps because this mystery has not yet been fully resolved, and perhaps there are still clues waiting to be discovered. Because some secrets of history are still waiting to be revealed.